So thank you, Pat. I now want to invite David Altig up to the stage. David is the Executive Vice President and Director of Research for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. David is going to help us this morning by providing some data to frame this morning's panel on the future of work. And I know for many of you, for me, this is a conversation I'm very much looking forward to, and the data that David is going to provide is going to help contextualize that conversation. So please welcome David Altig.
Well, I've been tasked with talking about today's work in 10 minutes to a group that knows more about the topic than I do. So I decided to do what I do best, which is basically share my confusion and anxiety with you. There's three questions that I'm going to focus on. One has to do with the geographic mobility of today's work and what that might mean for sort of the orientation of workforce efforts at kind of the macro level. Second, I'm going to ask a question about the current efforts in tax reform and whether they are adequate to the issue of workforce development efforts, particularly for low and moderate income communities. And then as a transition into the next panel, my own musings about the future of work. So, question number one, should we be thinking locally and acting globally? Here's a map. It comes from Forbes. What it is literally is the flow of exemptions on tax returns across two cities, Chicago and Atlanta. The red lines are inflows into the city. The red lines are outflows. Because these are tax filings, there's a pretty good proxy for jobs. And what you clearly see is jobs are on the move. What you also see in the data is people not so much. This is the interstate migration rates. This comes from the OECD 2016 report on the United States, a fabulous document with lots of workforce development sort of issues in it if you've never looked at it. So I look at the first charts, I look at this chart, and I ask the following question. Is it not the case that successful workforce policy in scale will have to somehow change this picture? And doesn't that mean that workforce service providers will have to think globally, or at least nationally? My own thinking on these things is very much influenced by this MAX project that my staff was engaged in, staff at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. MAX, the Metro Atlanta Exchange for Workforce Solutions, is actually just sort of a repository for providers of workforce services and clients of workforce services. That's not really what's germane to this conversation. What's germane to this conversation is what led to the creation of this website, portal, whatever you want to call it. It started off with a survey of workforce providers in the Metro Atlanta area. The survey respondents were about 200 providers providing services in 300 locations around Atlanta. And here was the most stunning result. Only 30%, less than 1/3 of all the workforce development providers in the area had contact with at least one employer. Think of that. Now, here's sort of the point to this question. If workforce development providers are not talking to employers across the street, what's the likelihood that they're talking to employers who are actually employing? This came up a little bit yesterday in the generation conversation about what do you do with rural workers where the local jobs are simply not there? How do you deal with that? But I think that first picture I showed you, Atlanta, Chicago, indicates that the problem is very much broader than rural to urban migration. It is a general problem within the United States, and one we have to ask whether we have our heads around as we act locally, for the most part, in our workforce development efforts. Tax reform. It's a public policy question of the moment. A lot of energy is going to be devoted into thinking about what the best sort of tax reform is. But what would real tax reform for the issues we're talking about here in this conference What would that look like? Well, we know that if we think the way we ought to think about taxes, there are really two moving pieces. One piece is the amount you hand over to the government. That's all the stuff in the black text there. And the other is all the stuff the government gives back to you. And there's not a person in this room who won't look at this list and says, well, if we're talking about work opportunities, the work proposition for low and moderate income workers, it's that bottom red stuff was where all the action is. This was also, I was in one of the concurrent sessions yesterday. Susan Crandall talked about a UMass project that was all about the cliff effects of taking away the red stuff. Here's another look at it. This is from a study that, again, this is very influential in my thinking about things lately, by Alan Auerbach, Larry Kotlikoff, and Daryl Keller, where they go to the survey of consumer finances. And basically 4 people in that sample, they divide them up into wealth quintiles and ask what are the tax rates, effective tax rates, that these people face when you take into account those cliff effects on public service provision. Well, one thing you see right away is that if you looked at average tax rates, looks like we have a very progressive system. If you look at marginal tax rates, the dollar that, what people have to pay on the next dollar they earn, it's not a progressive system at all. The least wealthy among us pay about the same tax rate as the most wealthy among us. And this ain't the worst part of the story. The worst part of the story is the dispersion across the experience of people within these wealth quintiles. So those second 2 columns there, they indicate the spread in the Survey of Consumer Finances, these are real people, of the tax rates that people might face by virtue of their particular circumstances. Now I want you to look at that most right-hand column. Some poor person is paying a 934% tax rate. That means for the privilege of earning $1, you get to give the government $9. Now that's an extreme outlier. For the next quintile, it's not much better. But tax rates, marginal tax rates, in the range of 50% to 70% are not at all rare. We're in the business of providing a value proposition for workforce development programs. That has to be overcome. If you're talking about real tax reform for workforce development, for low and moderate income workers, which is often what we are talking about. If you're talking about opportunity tax reform, you can't ignore this. And I'll ask rhetorically, who's talking about it? Where in the current debate about federal tax policy is this issue germane, even present? I will note that this is a low wealth problem. The spread of tax rates, the sort of inefficiencies according to circumstances, the horizontal equity, if you will, the tax system, is not so big in the upper wealth quintiles, probably bigger than it should be. And tax reform aimed at that is a good thing, but this is a low income, low wealth problem. Finally, the robots are coming. How do we keep them from eating us? I've lifted this slide from a presentation by Professor David Deming at Harvard, who was given at the National Association of Business Economists last week. And basically, this is sort of an exercise you're familiar with. It sort of divides up jobs using ONET data in the quadrants, sort of high math skill, low math skill requirements, high social skill, low social skill requirements. And this plots the employment shares going back to 1980 in those quadrants. And what do you see? The growing employment shares are in jobs that require a high level of social skills. Math skills aren't the predictor. Social skills are. And if you look at wages, it's exactly the same story. Now, you're familiar with sort of a different way of thinking about this based on the work of David Autor and his co-authors, and where the gains have been to cognitive, non-routine sorts of tasks. But this is where the future comes in, because one of the things artificial intelligence, robots, computers are going to take over are a whole ton of cognitive, non-routine tasks. Deming's point was the following: what's the one thing that computers, that robots, that artificial intelligence probably can't do? Probably can't be a human being. Human beings excel at social context, at understanding meaning, emotion, in face-to-face transactions. The future is there. This high social rather than cognitive non-routine stuff was meaningful. Deming points out this is where we're headed. So it raises to me a bunch of questions. So as we think about reimagining job training, education, to embed in people the technical skills that we know they're going to need, can we do that without losing sight of the fact that 2/3 of the 3 R's is reading and writing? Second, as we contemplate the causes and consequences of, for example, females being underrepresented in STEM occupations, maybe we ought to throw into that the underrepresentation of males in the humanities, particularly as we continue to struggle with the vexing problem of the continuing decline in labor force participation by prime-age males. And finally, as we think about what technology can mean to the workforce development provider community, and we leverage that to bring things to scale, to bring training to scale, can we do that while maintaining the delivery of the skill set that will be critical to avoid the ropocalypse? And that is to be sure people can talk to one another. People can communicate with one another. People can engage in the one thing that human beings can beat computers at, and that is the retail business of human interaction. I hope the next panel, who I will invite up at this point, might be able to help with that and ease some of my anxiety. Thanks for your time.